The silence of the castle's north tower was not peace, it was imprisonment. For 847 años, the deaf queen had lived in that isolation, counting the days through the floor's vibrations as servants' footsteps passed along the staircases, through the observation of shadows dancing through the small window slits, through a solitude so complete that her very name had been erased from court records. No one dared call her queen. She was simply her, the thing upstairs, the family curse. Her son, the Vampire King, had inherited the throne 3 centuries ago and never once stepped into the tower, not a single time in 300 years. The servants received simple instructions: leave food on the tray at dawn, remove it at night. No contact. No glances, no acknowledgement that a human being, or something close to it, lived beyond that iron door. The Death Queen hadn't heard a word in centuries, but that didn't mean she didn't understand the world. Her eyes were extraordinarily sharp, reading every expression of horror on the faces of the startled servants who entered. Her hands learned to read the world through vibrations, through textures, through subtle changes in the air. She knew she was hated. She knew she was considered broken, flawed, a stain on the vampiric bloodline that should have been eliminated generations ago. But she had learned to live with it, shut away, converting her isolation into a kind of living death that was acceptable to everyone. It was safe that way. It was easy. No one had to deal with her existence. Everything changed the night the young waiter first entered the castle. His name was Lucas, son of a waitress who had worked in the kitchen for 20 years. He was 19, his hands trembling when he served drinks to the vampiric nobles, his eyes avoiding direct contact with any member of the court. He was invisible in the way the invisible understand, a poor human in a world of power and immortality. But there was something different about him, a kindness that hadn't been beaten out of him by the world, a compassion that still breathed where others had long since died inside. When his mother told him about the Death Queen, about how she lived completely alone, without communication, without any form of human interaction, something within Lucas refused to accept the normalcy of that cruelty. He asked his mother to teach him sign language, something she knew because she had grown up with a deaf grandmother. For months, the Vampire King had confrontado sua mãe, e what happened in that encounter was so shocking que a news spread through a court like poison in water. She had refused to abaixar, she had refused to pedir for perdón por ter contacto con un humano. Y peor, she had looked her own son en los olhos, something she hadn't done in 300 años, y had spoken through signs que li no entiendia, but whose meaning was crystal clara. She despreciaba him. That simple refusal de submisión had tornado o véu de normalidad que cobría o vampírico kingdom, revelando as fissuras que hadn't always been present, hidden under centuries de forced obediencia. Os conselheiros da corte habían inmediatamente dividido. Some mantenían a posição do Vampire King. A Death Queen é corsada, uma abominação que deveria ter sido eliminada gerações atrás. Her desabilidade era sinal de ancestral weakness, uma contaminação do Royal Bloodline que justificava her confinamento. Alafiar a remover a laiva era já extraordinária clemência. Mas outros advisores esperavam something different nos corredores. There were rumors que o imprisionamento não era simple rejeição, que era intencional silenciamento, que a Death Queen havia descoberto something terrível about a origem do vampírico bloodline, something que poderia chatear o vampírico King's poder se revelado.
Um particular adivisor, Countess Elizabeth, a vampira que havia servido a vampírica mãe da morta anos atrás, pegou a questionar a laudo. Se era antiga o suficiente para recordar tempos antes da isolação. She que a Queen's deafness não era uma corsa, mas um acidente que havia ocorrido durante um ritual que a corte nunca openamente discutiu. Quando she pegou as public questions about as circunstâncias daquele ritual, about what exactly had happened to make a queen deaf, o Vampire King silenciou-a com explícitos threats de execução. Mas o dano já estava feito. As sementes da dúvida haviam esprotado. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, Lucas pegou recebendo nightly visits. Um servo trazia pão e água e o esperava quick words through his fingers. Ele também conhecia os sinais da língua que sua mãe havia taught. Lucas learned que a Deaf Queen havia explicitamente requistado sua religião, que se havia ofertado something a seu som em escâmbio por sua vida. Something valioso, something que o Vampire King em seu toda vez não podera. Mas o que era? O servant não sabia ou poderia dizer.
What Lucas knew was that there was a war happening in the shadows, a war over truth, power, and the right to exist as one is. The news that the Deaf Queen had been communicating reached the ears of the castle's human servants. Suddenly, the story of the waitress who had taught her son signs was no longer a silent act of kindness, it was a scandal. Some called her a heroine, others accused her of treason. Lucas's mother was interrogated by the court guards, threatened, questioned about her motives. She remained calm and said only that she had taught her son a language out of compassion, without knowing he would use it so explosively. But even as she lied, her eyes glowed with something that could have been pride, or defiance, or both. 3 nights after his incarceration, Lucas woke to vibrations along the floor. Footsteps, many footsteps. The dungeon door opened, and the Vampire King himself descended, accompanied by 2 guards. His eyes were black storms. His voice was a blade. He explained, with deliberate precision, that Lucas would be freed, but under one condition. He would be sent as a spy. His job would be to report everything the Deaf Queen communicated, every gesture, every signed word, every emotional reaction. In return, his mother would live. Refuse, and both would die. Vampiric blood is patient, he explained, but it is also absolute. Lucas looked into the eyes of the immortal being before him and understood that there was an abyss between him and anything he could comprehend. He nodded that he agreed. Did he have a choice? As the chains were removed, a question burned in his mind with more intensity than the silver had burned his skin. Why was the Vampire King allowing him to return? What secret had the Deaf Queen offered in exchange for his life? And when she discovered he'd been turned into a traitor, what would she do? In the next part, alliances will be tested and an ancient truth will emerge from the shadows. Don't miss it. Lucas returned to the North Tower with the weight of a secret that poisoned him. Each time the Deaf Queen approached him, communicating through slow, patient signs, he felt his own betrayal burn in his chest like live coals. She showed him the world through her hands, stories about the centuries she had lived, about the beauty she could perceive despite the darkness of isolation, about hope that had emerged the moment he touched her ear. And he was documenting everything mentally, preparing reports that would destroy this newfound connection. Guilt consumed him. But everything changed when she placed her hand over his chest and began to tell a story the Vampire King had spent centuries trying to erase. The story began 700 years ago when the Queen could still hear. She had been chosen to participate in an ancient ritual, a ritual supposedly meant to elevate the vampiric bloodline to levels of power never before achieved. The ritual required a sacrifice. Someone would have to abandon a sense for the kingdom to gain strength. It was supposedly voluntary, but the truth was different. The vampire king, then a prince, had been too weak to participate in the ritual himself. So, in secret, along with his advisors, he had manipulated the ceremonies. He had forced his mother to be the sacrifice. He had taken her hearing not through pure magic, but through a profane ritual involving torture and betrayal. And when she had discovered the truth, she had begun to question her son's power. She had threatened to reveal that the entire kingdom was built on lies, that the vampire king was a fraud who had sacrificed his own mother to gain power he didn't even deserve. So he had imprisoned her. Lucas watched as her fingers trembled while telling this story. He watched as tears streamed down her face. He saw the transformation of a woman who had resigned herself to solitude into a furious woman, finally speaking the truth she had been forced to keep silent. And in that moment, Lucas's loyalty was tested not by threats, but by something more powerful: compassion. He understood that there were two prisons in the castle, one of iron and stone, and another of silence. He understood that he had been sent as a tool of oppression, not a savior. And he understood that he had to make a choice that would determine who he truly was. But before he could decide, the tower door burst open violently. Countess Elizabeth entered, accompanied by 3 other vampires, advisors who had begun to question the vampire king's power. She had discovered the truth through fragments of conversation from ancient records she had unearthed in the castle archives. She knew about the ritual. She knew about the lie that had become the foundation of the throne. And she had come to ask the Deaf Queen to publicly rise against her son, to denounce the truth before the entire court, to reclaim her rightful place as the true authority of the realm. The Deaf Queen looked at Lucas, then at Elizabeth, then at her own trembling hands. The decision she faced wasn't simple. She had spent 700 years in silence. She had built a life, albeit an isolated one, within that confinement. Revealing the truth meant war. It meant destruction. It meant that her own son would be condemned, possibly executed. Even he who had betrayed her was still her son. But it also meant that countless others, humans, oppressed vampires, creatures living under the regime of lies, would be freed. Lucas took a deep breath and made his move. He placed his hand on Elizabeth's shoulder and shook his head. Elizabeth, surprised, began to question, but Lucas used signs to communicate something Elizabeth understood imperfectly, but viscerally. There was another way, one that didn't involve bloodshed, one that could transform the realm without destroying it. Lucas then revealed he had been sent as a traitor, but had done something the Vampire King hadn't expected. He had begun teaching the Deaf Queen how to communicate with the outside world. He had told her about the people in the castle who already questioned the king's power. He had paved the way for something greater, an alliance. If the Deaf Queen emerged not as an accuser, but as a reformer, as someone who could restore truth while preserving continuity, she could be accepted. She could lead a transformation that didn't require assassination, only honesty. Countess Elizabeth saw the brilliance of the plan. But there was a problem. The Vampire King already suspected. He had ordered Lucas followed, and at that very moment he was ascending the tower stairs. The Deaf Queen saw his shadow appear in the doorway, her own son, her tormentor, her heir. And she did something no one expected. She smiled, because she finally understood her own power. It wasn't the power to destroy, it was the power to reveal. And the moment of truth had arrived. When the Vampire King saw that his mother had allies, that his lie had crumbled, that everything he had built his life upon was based on sand, what would he do? The Vampire King froze at the sight before him. His mother standing something she hadn't done in centuries, surrounded by rebellious advisors and a miserable human who should have been chained. His eyes, which he had kept cold and calculating for 300 years, exploded in fury. But it wasn't the blind fury of a despotic monarch. When the Vampire King saw that his mother had allies, that his lie had crumbled, that everything he had built his life upon was based on sand, what would he do? The Vampire King froze at the sight before him. His mother, standing something she hadn't done in centuries, surrounded by rebellious advisors and a miserable human who should have been chained. His eyes, which he had kept cold and calculating for 300 years, exploded in fury. But it wasn't the blind fury of a despotic monarch.
It was something far more dangerous, the panic of someone whose power was crumbling in real time. "You," he said, pointing at Lucas with fingers trembling with suppressed rage. "I should have killed you when I had the chance. Instead, I created a martyr." His voice echoed off the stone walls with a resonance that made the air vibrate. He turned to Countess Elizabeth, his fangs bared in a snarl more animal than human. "And you, court traitor, conspirator, you will be executed for treason." But the Death Queen raised her hand, a simple gesture, and Lucas transmitted her words aloud, his young human voice cutting through the gloom like a blade. She said he had been executed long ago, that a man who sacrifices his mother for power doesn't deserve to be called king, that everything in his kingdom was built on her blood, on her suffering, on her silent resistance. The Vampire King laughed, a sound that wasn't amusement but despair disguised as arrogance. "You believe you can challenge me? You, who are deaf, who are weak, who spent 700 years in a room? You have no power here. I still command the legions. I still control the blood that flows through this kingdom." It was at that moment that the tower doors opened completely. The guards didn't come. Instead, servants came. Dozens of them. Humans who had worked in the castle for generations, who had heard the whispered stories about the Death Queen, who had begun to question why a woman had been punished for something she hadn't done. Lucas's mother was among them, her eyes firm, her hands forming signs that all the servants she had taught understood. She had spent weeks, months preparing this. She had taught sign language to dozens of people, creating an invisible communication network that the Vampire King couldn't control, couldn't silence, because it didn't use sound. The Vampire King recoiled. For the first time in centuries, his numerical advantage had vanished. Yes, he was immortal. Yes, he was powerful. But he was surrounded. And a crowd is a force that even ancient vampires learn to fear. "If you try to attack us," Lucas said, still transmitting the Deaf Queen's words through signs that the entire crowd could now see, "everyone in the kingdom will know the truth. Everyone will know that you sacrificed your own mother, that you are a fraud, that your power was built on lies. Your allies will turn against you. Your legions will question your authority. You won't survive the revelation."
Not because we will kill you, but because your own kingdom will consume you." The Vampire King's face crumpled. His lips curled into a snarl that revealed all his impotence disguised as power. He raised his hand, and for a terrifying moment it seemed he might attack. It seemed he might unleash violence that would destroy everyone in that room. His mother didn't flinch. She simply looked at him. Finally, after 700 years, she looked her son in the eyes without fear. And it was at that moment that something impossible happened. The Vampire King's vampiric power began to dissipate. Not suddenly, but visibly. As if every word that had been spoken, every truth that had been revealed, every connection that had been established between the deaf queen and the outside world had severed the chains that bound his power. The ancient ritual that had taken her hearing had also created an energetic link between them. While she had been isolated, silent, unable to communicate, that energy had remained imprisoned but intact. Now, with her voice finally being heard through Lucas, through the signs spreading through the crowd, that energy was being released. It was flowing back through the ties that connected them, and it was draining him. The Vampire King fell to his knees. Not from physical injury, but from internal collapse. Centuries of power built on theft were being returned. Centuries of vampiric energy he had unjustly appropriated were returning to their original source. The deaf queen descended a single step. Her eyes glowed with power no one had suspected she possessed. And Lucas, translating her signs for the awestruck crowd, whispered the words she had held in her heart for 700 years. "Now, my son, you will learn what it truly means to be heard." But there was something more in her signs, a promise, a threat, a secret yet to be revealed that would soon make the entire kingdom question if they had chosen the right side. What would that secret be? And what would be the true price of this revelation? The days that followed the Vampire King's downfall were chaotic in a way no one had foreseen. The kingdom didn't erupt into civil war as many feared. Instead, it entered something deeper, questioning. Every vampire, every servant, every creature that had lived under the regime of lies began to reevaluate everything they had believed. The deaf queen didn't assume the throne. That would have been too easy, too predictable. Instead, she did something far more revolutionaria. She shared the power. Countess Elizabeth was appointed to lead reforms in the court structure. The advisors who had conspired were publicly recognized for their courage, and Lucas, the simple waiter, son of a waitress, was designated as the queen's official communicator. His job was to translate her signs for anyone who needed to understand. He became the queen's voice, but in a way he had never imagined. He also became the bridge between two worlds, the human and the vampiric. What had begun as a gesture of compassion had transformed into revolution. But there was a price. The more power the deaf queen recovered, the clearer it became that the ancient ritual had left deep scars on both of them. The energy that had been stolen from her for 700 years wasn't just power, it was her very essence, fragmented and imprisoned. Now that it was being released, she began to feel pains no cure could alleviate. Her eyes began to glow with a golden color that humans couldn't bear to observe for long. Her hands acquired a texture that seemed almost translucent. She was changing. Not dying, but not remaining the same either. She was becoming something new, something that existed between worlds. The Vampire King, on the other hand, had been diminished. The power he had stolen from his mother had been the foundation of his immortality, of his vampiric strength. Without it, he had begun to age, not rapidly, but visibly. His hair turned gray, his skin began to wrinkle. For the first time in 300 years, the Vampire King was mortal, and he was enraged. 3 weeks after the revelation, Lucas discovered his body. The Vampire King had poisoned himself with a substance no physician could identify. A final choice of power. He wouldn't allow his mother the satisfaction of watching him fully age. He had died as a monarch, not a vassal. It was a death Lucas understood, even if he couldn't approve. The Deaf Queen didn't weep when she learned. Or perhaps she did, but in a way Lucas couldn't fully read. She merely closed her eyes and made a sign that meant closure. Then she asked to be alone. For the first time since her liberation, she asked to return to the North Tower, not as a prison, but as a choice. But when Lucas went up to visit her days later, he found something unexpected. The Deaf Queen was standing by the window, and her eyes glowed with a golden color that was neither vampiric nor human.
She looked at him and made un sign to left him speechless. She could hear. Not with her ears, that part of her body had been permanently damaged, but with something, a new sensitivity, a new sense that had emerged when the power had been fully integrated. She was telling Lucas that the ancient ritual had been reversible, but in a way no one had understood. The change that had occurred when her power returned wasn't just restoration, it was evolution. She was now the first vampire of the new bloodline, a bloodline not built on theft or power, but on truth and acceptance. And there were others. Countess Elizabeth had begun to glow too. The servants who had helped were beginning to show signs of transformation. A change was happening in the kingdom that went far beyond politics. It was spiritual. It was fundamental. Lucas realized his mother had disappeared. When he searched for her, he found a simple letter, written in sign language translated into words. She had left the castle. She had understood that she now belonged to a different world. She had renounced humanity in a way Lucas never could. And she had left him something, an amulet made of a metal he didn't recognize, with symbols that glowed softly in the darkness. The Deaf Queen approached Lucas and touched his ear, that same gesture that had started everything. But this time she whispered words directly into his mind, words he only felt, not heard. She said that everything had only just begun, that the truth that had been released would continue to expand, that other queens, other kings, other secrets buried for centuries would begin to emerge, and that Lucas would witness all of it, that he would be chosen to tell these stories to a world that desperately needed to understand that true power doesn't come from domination, but from acceptance. Lucas descended from the tower with a racing heart. He sat before the castle window and looked out at the world. And then he sighed and raised his fingers. He began to sign, as if conversing with someone who couldn't hear, as if the sign language he had learned out of compassion had become the language the universe truly spoke. If you want to know what Lucas discovers next, what other revelations emerge when truth begins to spread like wildfire through realms built on lies, if you want to understand the true consequences of freeing a queen who had been a prisoner for centuries, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications now.
Because the story of the Vampire King's deaf mother is just the beginning.